My neighbor was stealing my water, so I absolutely ruined him. Los Angeles drama. Hey, Reddit. Buckle up because this one's a ride. Moving into a new home is supposed to be exciting, right? A fresh start, new neighbors, maybe a chance to live the dream. But when I moved to my new house in Los Angeles, I walked straight into the kind of drama that could make a Netflix series. What started as petty revenge turned into the ultimate power move that brought my entitled neighbor's empire crashing down. Let me tell you how it all unfolded. The move, a rough welcome to the neighborhood. I recently bought a house in Los Angeles. It wasn't in perfect shape, it was more of a charming fixer-upper, as realtors like to say, but the price was a steal. The previous owners, who were family friends, hadn't lived there for years and had warned me that the neighborhood had some quirks. What they didn't mention was that the house had practically become the community's unofficial hangout spot while it sat empty. The day I moved in, it became clear just how far people had taken that privilege. My first discovery? Someone had parked an old, rusty bike in my garage. Not in front of it. Not leaning against the wall. Inside the garage. No note, no explanation, just a random bike, as if my property was a public storage unit. I dragged it out to the street and called a contractor to install a proper gate immediately. That night, some angry old man, we'll call him Grumpy Old Guy, or GOG, showed up banging on the gate. I stayed inside and watched as he muttered to himself for 15 minutes before storming off. Strike one, neighborhood. An open invitation for chaos. As I started settling in, I realized that GOG wasn't the only problem. The neighborhood seemed to be under the impression that my property was still abandoned. Cars routinely parked across my driveway, blocking access to my garage. Delivery drivers left packages in my yard as if it were a public drop-off zone. Once, I even found someone's dog tied to my fence. It was clear that reclaiming my space would be an uphill battle. After a week of this nonsense, I slapped a huge no parking sign on my gate, and most of the random cars stopped showing up. But GOG? He wasn't about to give up so easily. Every time I stepped outside, his glare followed me like a heat-seeking missile. I could feel his resentment from 50 feet away. My friends, the house's previous owners, had warned me about him. Apparently, he'd been using my yard as his personal parking lot and storage area while the house sat empty. Losing that privilege must have stung. The water pressure mystery. One evening, about a week after I moved in, I was taking a shower when something strange happened. The water pressure dropped suddenly, not the usual kind of drop you get when someone flushes a toilet, but more like the pressure had been cut in half. It was so bad that rinsing the shampoo out of my hair became a challenge. As I stood there, annoyed and slightly confused, I heard a faint mechanical hum coming from the direction of GOG's house. It didn't take long to figure out that the sound was a water pump. Now, in LA, multi-story houses like GOG's often need pumps to get water to rooftop tanks. I'd seen his tank before, a big, weathered container perched on his roof. But something about the timing of the pump kicking on right when my pressure dropped felt suspicious. The next day, I paid closer attention. Sure enough, every time my water pressure dipped, his pump roared to life. Coincidence? Maybe. But after 3 days of this pattern, I knew something was up. Piecing it together, I started testing my theory by turning on taps around the house at different times. Without fail, whenever his pump turned off, my water pressure returned to normal. That's when it hit me, GOG was stealing water from my supply. It wasn't just a hunch, it was the only explanation that made sense. But how? My house had been vacant for years, so somewhere along the line, he must have tapped into my water lines. I started digging through old water bills, and the evidence was all there. Even during the years when the house was supposed to be unoccupied, the bills were abnormally high. Everyone had assumed the high costs were due to leaks, but now it was clear GOG had been siphoning water for years, saving himself who knows how much money. At first, I felt angry. But the more I thought about it, the more his audacity amused me. This guy had been stealing from me before I even moved in, and he had no idea I'd caught on. I decided it was time to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. The plan, turn off the tap, confronting GOG directly felt pointless. He didn't strike me as the kind of guy who would admit to wrongdoing, let alone apologize. I could have called the cops or filed a formal complaint, but that felt too bureaucratic and honestly, too boring. I wanted revenge, and I wanted it to be satisfying. One evening, I heard his pump kick on. The hum was unmistakable, and it was loud enough to hear from my living room. I waited a few minutes, then walked out to my water main and turned it off. That's it. No confrontation, no yelling, just a simple twist of a valve. At first, I didn't think much would happen. Maybe he'd noticed the water had stopped and figure out the gig was up. But what unfolded over the next 24 hours was more than I ever expected. The fallout, karma strikes. With no water flowing into his pump, it kept running, trying to fill his rooftop tanks. But there was nothing to pump. The system overexerted itself, drawing more and more power until the inevitable happened. His outdated 90s-era wiring couldn't handle the load, and by 3 a.m., his entire house went dark. No water. No electricity. Total chaos. The shouting began almost immediately. I could hear GOG's tenants yelling from their windows, demanding answers. In Los Angeles, landlords are legally required to provide utilities like water and electricity, so his tenants were understandably furious. The noise carried well into the night, with accusations flying back and forth. By morning, one of the tenants had packed up and left. The other gave him an ultimatum: fix everything immediately, or they were out too. The collapse of his empire. Within 48 hours, both tenants were gone. They filed complaints with the city, which slapped GOG with a hefty $500 fine. To make matters worse, he had to refund their security deposits and couldn't rent the units again until he upgraded the wiring and plumbing. That kind of work isn't cheap, especially in Los Angeles. Without his tenants, GOG had no income, and it didn't take long for him to realize he was in over his head. A few days later, GOG showed up at my gate. He looked tired and defeated, like the weight of the world had finally crushed him. "Did you turn off your water?" he asked, his voice dripping with frustration. I played dumb. "Oh, yeah," I said casually. "I had a leak and had to shut it off while the plumber checked things out." "Why?" The look on his face was priceless, part anger, part realization, and part sheer helplessness. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, knowing full well he couldn't prove anything. The aftermath. With no tenants, mounting fines, and no way to afford repairs, GOG packed up and moved in with his daughter. His once bustling property now sits empty, a quiet reminder of his arrogance. Meanwhile, I've hired a plumber to remove any road connections to my water lines and upgrade my system for good measure. These days, my mornings are peaceful. I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over my quiet street. Every now and then, I glance at GOG's empty house and smile. Who knew a simple twist of a valve could change everything? The saga continues, a neighborhood transformed. After GOG packed up and left, the entire neighborhood started to feel different. Quieter. More peaceful. It was as if his departure had lifted a dark cloud over the block. For the first time since moving in, I could relax without feeling like I was under constant scrutiny. No more angry glares when I walked my dogs. No more shady side-eye from GOG when I worked in the garden. It was bliss. But GOG's downfall didn't just impact me, it had ripple effects throughout the neighborhood. His house sat vacant for weeks, and the absence of his tenants left the area eerily still. Curious neighbors started to come out of the woodwork, asking what had happened. I kept my answers vague, saying something about issues with his property. Most of them just nodded knowingly, as if they'd been waiting for GOG's luck to run out. The neighborhood gossip. You know how every neighborhood has a group of people who know everything? Well, I'd unknowingly stepped into the middle of a tight-knit web of gossip. Apparently, GOG wasn't just an annoyance to me, he'd been causing problems for years. One neighbor told me that he'd once built a makeshift shed in their backyard without asking, claiming it was temporary storage for his tools. Another said he had a history of petty disputes with almost everyone on the block, from arguing over parking spots to accusing people of stealing his mail. One particularly talkative neighbor, Mrs. Patel, spilled the tea on his financial situation. "He's been struggling ever since his wife passed away," she said, shaking her head. The tenants were his only income. But he refused to fix anything in that house. You reap what you sow. While I wasn't exactly sympathetic, it did paint a clearer picture of why GOG had been so bitter. Still, that didn't excuse his entitlement or the fact that he'd been stealing from me for years. A new era for the block. As time went on, GOG's absence ushered in a sense of renewal for the neighborhood. The empty house was eventually listed for sale, and within a month, it was snapped up by a young couple. They were friendly, excited to start their lives in LA, and best of all, they weren't GOG. We hit it off immediately, bonding over shared renovation horror stories and a mutual appreciation for quiet neighbors. The couple wasted no time fixing up the property. They tore down the old, rusted rooftop water tank and replaced it with a modern plumbing system. They repainted the house, planted new landscaping, and even put up festive lights during the holidays. For the first time, the property looked like it belonged in a thriving neighborhood, not a ghost town. The unexpected visit. About 3 months after GOG left, I got an unexpected knock at my gate. When I opened it, I was shocked to see him standing there, looking more disheveled than ever. His face was lined with stress, and he clutched a folder of paperwork like it was a lifeline. "I need to talk," he said, his tone less demanding than before. It wasn't the angry, entitled GOG I'd known. It was a man who looked like he'd hit rock bottom. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside to hear him out. He explained, in halting sentences, that he was trying to fight the fines and had come to clear the air. He stopped short of admitting to stealing water, but danced around the topic, blaming the house's wiring for the issues and suggesting that the city had been unfair. I didn't let him off the hook. "Look, I get that you were in a tough spot," I said, "but stealing isn't the way to solve your problems. Maybe this is a chance to start fresh." He stared at me for a moment, as if weighing whether to argue, but then he just nodded and shuffled away. It was the last time I saw him. A lesson in boundaries. Looking back, I'm amazed at how a simple act of pettiness spiraled into something so dramatic. What started as a battle over water became a lesson in standing up for myself and setting boundaries. I used to avoid confrontation, but this experience taught me that sometimes you have to push back, especially when someone is taking advantage of you. Since then, I've made it a point to stay on top of my home security and maintenance. I installed cameras, reinforced my gate, and even had a professional plumber inspect my entire water system. No more surprises, no more rogue connections, just peace of mind. What I learned: if there's one thing I've taken away from this whole ordeal, it's the importance of knowing your worth. GOG thought he could walk all over me because he'd been getting away with it for years. But when you stand your ground, even the most entitled people can't hold their power over you. Today, my home feels like the sanctuary it was meant to be. The neighborhood is friendlier, quieter, and more connected than ever. And as I sit on my porch with my dogs, sipping coffee and enjoying the California sunshine, I can't help but feel a little bit proud. I didn't just reclaim my space, I helped transform an entire block. And honestly, that's the most satisfying revenge of all. TLDR. Moved into a fixer-upper in Los Angeles and discovered my neighbor was stealing water. Shut off my supply while his pump was running, causing his system to overload and fry his wiring. His tenants left, he got fined, and he was forced to move out. A few months later, his house was sold to a lovely couple, and the neighborhood has never been better. Petty revenge turned into a major upgrade for the entire block.